Mister? How do you operate this Twitter thing or this Instagram thing or whatever the heck? You're supposed to know all this stuff. Anyway, welcome back to the show.
All right, you fantasy football players. It is June. Some people say way too early, but it's never too early for fantasy football, something we're going to dive into here on the program this season. And my expert is standing by. Please help me welcome the one, the only Kyle Senra from the Full Press Fantasy Podcast. He joins right now from north of the border. What's up, man?
Hey, Snowman. Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's going to be a little quick one today because we have a list, and I requested this list because this will get our feet wet into the into the fantasy football world. This list is Kyle's top 10 fantasy quarterbacks entering 2024. We'll start at number 10 with Jaden Daniels, the rookie for Washington.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say for this list, this is a dynasty ranking. I do not have my redraft rankings yet complete. So, this is viewed with the long term. So if you were and the way I do rankings, I do tend to favor towards how do I rank them if I was to draft them.
Mm-hmm.
So, especially in dynasty leagues, there is the difference between draft value and then trade value afterwards. And that could be
right.
A lot more complex.
Right.
So I find rankings are most useful during drafts. So that's kind of what I create them for. And if I'm starting up a team, these young quarterbacks are really enticing. And actually for that 10th spot, going back and forth between Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels, but ultimately the rookie that I want the most in fantasy is Jaden Daniels. Maybe Caleb is a better overall quarterback, but Daniels' skill set, his speed, his ability to run, that'll give him a really solid, safe fantasy floor. Now Caleb might have, again, because he's the better quarterback, the long-term floor of, he could play in the NFL for 15 years. There might be some concerns with Daniels injury-wise, not to say Caleb can't get hurt himself, but I think, on fantasy football teams, I'm trying to win as often as I can, and I think Jaden Daniels can hit the ground running fantasy-wise, literally because of his legs, but also because he is a pretty good passer. And I would say he's even a better passer than the guy I have at number 9. That guy might possess even more athletic upside. So, what do you think my take of Daniels over Caleb?
And speaking of number 9, we go to Indianapolis and find Anthony Richardson.
Well, so A-Rich, yes, quite the we don't have a rich history of games, even though he is technically a veteran in his second season, but we only have a handful of starts. So tremendous upside in those games, especially as a runner, but just as a touchdown producer in general. A lot of that is rushing touchdowns. 4 in, I think, 5 starts. So that's doubt he'll keep that percentage up over the course of an entire season. But if he ever does, he could really reach to the upper echelon. So
absolutely,
we've seen it. Even if it's in small flashes, we've already seen it with Richardson, and that's ultimately was led me to have him ahead of Daniels, even though I don't think he's as polished as a passer as Daniels is yet. So he poses maybe even more long-term risk, and certainly we saw it last year. The injury risk is real with him. So they both kind of have similar risk, but Richardson might have more upside, so more payoff if worth the risk if he does hit. So Richardson at 9 for now.
Speaking of injuries, a fellow has gone through a lot of injuries, but still has a lot of upside. At number 8, we go to the Chargers and find Justin Herbert.
Yes, and this is fallen in rankings. I mean, it was only maybe 2 years ago where he was considered a top 2-3 quarterback and really asset overall in Dynasty Superflex leagues. I definitely remember a draft after his second season where he went ahead of Mahomes in the startup draft, his second overall. So those first couple of seasons were so explosive, and he's kind of his efficiency has tailed off the last couple of seasons. And I think he's fallen even further in rankings for me because of losing both his top targets, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams gone. Still has Josh Palmer, who the last couple seasons he's shown a connection with, especially when those other guys have been injured. So it seems like that's, Josh Palmer could pass as the wide receiver 1 on this team if like that. And that's at the low end. Maybe one of the young guys emerges, Quentin Johnston or Ladd McConkey. But from what we saw from Johnson last year, I don't necessarily want to bet on him necessarily taking the step up. And I know a lot of people like Ladd McConkey. I wasn't so crazy about him as a prospect. I know there's a lot of good per route numbers, but I tend to be someone who doesn't care as much about the per route numbers because the problem with McConkey is he just couldn't get on the field. He wasn't running routes. And ultimately, we want the guys that are out there more opportunities, more targets. So I look at a lot of his stats in the negative career average, dominator rating, which is an accumulation of players, how much of a team, touchdowns and yards a player accounts for. Pretty low in that regard. Some single season totals as well, pretty low. So I'm not crazy about McConkey. So it does seem like a step down for a receiver core, which is why Herbert takes a step down in rankings this year.
Let's go to number 7. We go to Arizona and we find Kyler Murray.
And it's almost the opposite. If the Chargers had drafted Malik Neighbors, I probably still have Herbert ahead of Murray, but he is one of the quarterbacks that the aforementioned Herbert has fallen behind. And ultimately, because the Cardinals did make that early investment in the first round on what appears to be a generational receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr. So
yes,
need a top target for Kyler Murray. But honestly, even at the end of his rookie season, but certainly a lot of the games last year, the tight end Trey McBride also emerged as could be a top target. Sneaky good acquisition after the Jags released Zay Jones. That's a good field stretcher, has had some pretty good seasons, both really in Buffalo, Oakland, and Jacksonville. Maybe not every single season consistent. He's had he's flashed over the course of several games and could be a key component for Kyler. We talk about rushing upside. Kyler has that. And I think now 2 years removed from the ACL tear, I think we'll start to see more of an old Kyler. He's a little older, obviously, but what we saw his first couple seasons, the old version of Kyler, as opposed to the last couple years, especially last year, he still put up solid fantasy floors, but it's just the rushing touchdowns weren't there for those ceiling performances. I expect we'll see more of that this year from Kyler.
At 6, we go to the AFC North and we find Joe Burrow from the Cincinnati Bengals.
So one thing about my rankings, first off, they can be found on fullpresscoverage.com. And one of the things you'll also see there is the consensus rankings. I'm part of the Fantasy Pros Accuracy competition, so my rankings get done through them. So you can see everyone who ranks on Fantasy Pros. It's the ECR, the expert consensus ranking. So yes, you're not the only one calling me an expert today, so it feels nice. But I guess we're all in agreement at this point because the guys I have in my top 6 dynasty rankings are all the same in the ECR. Maybe not the exact same order, but there's kind of like a line drawn after Joe Burrow, and then it goes down. The expert consensus number 7 actually is Anthony Richardson. So I'm a little higher on Kyler than consensus, but certainly Joe Burrow, it seems like it's the perfect match. I have him at 6. The ECR has him at 6. Seems like he's that last delineation line where he has true upside, just pure passing wise. But I think the reason we all have him 6 is because, or the majority of us, or because the average, he ends up at 6. It's because he doesn't produce as much on the ground as certainly most of the guys ahead of him. So he's kind of in a range where I'd rather invest in Burrow's arm than Kyler's legs or any of the rookies. And then, you look at Burrow's age relative to like a Dak Prescott, who I have, I think, at QB 12, just after those rookies. It's funny, a nice dichotomy there. The youngest guy in Caleb followed immediately by the oldest guy in Dak, or at least the oldest for these this top tier. So Burrows kind of seems like he's a perfect fit at 6, where he has more upside than everyone below him, but not as much as everyone ahead of him. So I like him at number 6. He's lost Tyler Boyd, so that might hurt. So I think it mostly, getting Jermaine Burton might help. I don't know if it's going to be quite a net neutral, but not enough of a loss to drop him though.
At 5, we find 2-time MVP Lamar Jackson as we stay in the AFC North.
And I mean, potential 2-time fantasy MVP, because both of those years, I believe that he won the MVP. He was the highest scoring player overall in fantasy. Actually, maybe not. I think he was 3rd last year. I'll have to look up those numbers, but he has shown through several seasons to have that certainly safe floor just because of the sheer yards he gets. And that's typically what we see from rushing quarterbacks. I tend to divide them into 2 categories. Who are the safe floor rushers for like safe floor in terms of fantasy production, who give you the ceiling. And a lot of it is the yards are what give you the floor, but the touchdowns, getting those rushing touchdowns in addition to anything passing, that's what gives you those true ceiling weeks. That's the 35, 40-point weeks where he significantly helps you win a week. And Lamar actually over the years has shown less of the safe floor and more of the boom bust weeks. And because he used to be really, really safe floor, but not a high ceiling, like especially his rookie year. But then that second year, I think as soon as he got Marquise Brown, that really changed because the touchdown upside came there more through passing than rushing, though. He's never had double-digit rushing, unlike a guy like Kyler we've talked about before. I believe his career high in rushing touchdowns is 6 or 7. He doesn't run a lot near the red zone. But what makes him good is that he's a good red zone passer, and then so he gets his ceiling more through passing touchdowns. But generally in fantasy leagues, those are 4 points, for the passing touchdowns and 6 for the rushing. So while I do like Lamar's ceiling, I might like ceiling from some of the other guys better because it is more tied to rushing touchdown production.
At 4, as we enter our top 5, we go to Houston and we find C.J. Stroud.
This feels like the value, I'm falling into the crowd, and the hype of the upside of what C.J. Stroud could be. To be honest, it might be similar to what we saw with Herbert, as I mentioned a couple years ago. Now, I'm not advocating to take Stroud ahead of the top 3. I think he maxes out at QB4, but there's certainly an argument to be made that Lamar or even Joe Burrow should go ahead of him. But what we saw from Stroud last year, a very accurate deep passer who seems to be aggressive in taking shots when they present themselves, got a really solid wide receiver core that honestly might have got better. There was a lot of times last year where Robert Woods was out there playing as the third wide receiver.
Yeah.
Noah Brown flashed for some games, but getting Stephon Diggs added to Nico Collins and to Tank Dell. We talk about like Kyler, maybe his stock improving because of Marvin Harrison Jr. It's the opposite end of the spectrum. You get the old guy to come in, but because of this receiving core that Stroud has, it feels like not only can he reproduce what he did last year, but even better that. So
yeah,
I think that the sky's the limit. And if he has a true monster season next year, I don't think it's out of the question that he starts going as the number 1 quarterback overall in Dynasty. Once I get my redraft rankings done, I don't know that he'll be number 4 if I'm strictly just looking at 2024, but for the long-term viability of Stroud, and honestly, for the sake of getting him, to sell him on the hype, I think he's worth it to take at QB4.
To our top 3 we go, and we started 3 in Philadelphia with Jalen Hurts.
I almost think this is too low because you could argue there's no quarterback that possesses a week in, week out ceiling like Jalen Hurts. It's tied to the rushing touchdowns. And one of the common misconceptions, or at least one of the common narratives I've heard this offseason, especially in fantasy football talk, does Jalen Hurts get affected by Jason Kelsey's retirement? Does that suddenly make his ability to score rushing touchdowns and really that short yardage rushing game in general, does that seriously compromise that? And I'd like to get your take on it, Snowman, because in my eyes, I think I view Kelsey as his best traits are his speed, his agility, his ability to get out to the second level and help with long runs. I don't know that the power is necessarily.
The other thing that's going to determine Jalen Hurts' value is how he does in terms of having a bounce back year. Because remember, Eagles started 10-1, and then they fell off the face of the earth and wound up playing on the road as a wild card team. And you didn't hear much from the candidacy of MVP for Jalen Hurts. And when San Francisco welcomed them and they got bludgeoned, everything fell apart. And I know a couple of Eagles experts that tell me it was well before the San Francisco game, and I tend to believe them. I think it was well before the San Francisco game. If you look at the coaching staff of Philadelphia, they are still not fully put together. Now, they've added some weapons, yes, but are those weapons going to be maximized? That's the question I have with the weapons surrounding Jalen Hurts. Speaking of weapons, you got this guy at number 2, reigning Super Bowl champion Patrick Mahomes from the Chiefs.
What a weapon they've added for him. I really like the rookie Xavier
Worthy.
I almost said Chandler Worthy. Clearly, I watched enough CFL. Unfortunately, his team beat my team last week, but that's okay. It's good for you, Chandler Worthy. But Xavier Worthy going to a winning team, I think the one thing the Chiefs have done this offseason, they've gotten speed outside guys that can run deep routes and also catch the ball. They're not relying on Marquez Valdez-Scantling being that deep threat anymore. In fact, he's gone. Talk about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the additions of Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy, I think, can help Mahomes get back after. I mean, fantasy wise, it's funny because fantasy wise, Hurts was the QB2 last year. From fantasy manager standpoint, there's no need for a bounce back. It's just, can you repeat what you did last year, which was like 14 or 15 rushing touchdowns? I would say 10 is maybe likely. You can probably get to double digit. 14, 15, not quite. So then you have to hope with Hurts, okay, the passing touchdowns go up, and they haven't quite added to that in that regard. I mean, Barkley actually probably is a pretty good addition receiving wise, but are they going to use him in that regard because they don't throw to the running back? But
exactly,
and the additions the Chiefs have made, it's been enough. Before the offseason started, I would have had Mahomes below Jalen Hurts as QB3, but not only getting Marquise Brown, but Xavier Worthy. Marquise Brown, I expect he's going to have a great season this year. I would suspect more targets than Worthy and Rashee Rice, and he probably will be pretty close to Kelsey, a lot closer than I think a lot of people might say. So my early tidbit is Marquise Brown could be a real good value in drafts this year because from what I've seen in people best ball drafts and stuff like that, seems like he's going in the same range as Rice and Worthy. Dynasty, I get it that he almost should be behind them because of the age, but in redraft, I think Marquise Brown would be a really good value because I think there's a chance he leads the team in targets. It's an outside chance, but if it's not Kelsey, I think it's him.
Well, we now have reached the top of the pile and the top of the mountain, and we go to Rich Stadium in Orchard Park to find Josh Allen at the top of Kyle's list.
So we've upped a lot of quarterbacks who've added weapons and kind of dropped guys who have lost weapons. Might make it odd to see Josh Allen at number 1, losing Stephon Diggs. But honestly, one of the things that happened last year is Stephon Diggs really started to drop off. A lot of people attested to the coaching change, but even the couple weeks just before the coaching change got made, he wasn't putting up his spike weeks like he was early in the season when Diggs was really going after it. And then, but Josh Allen still ended the season incredibly strong, back to rushing touchdowns. And last year was a career year for him. He's not someone that will necessarily get double-digit rushing touchdowns every year like Jalen Hurts, but he also typically gets more passing touchdowns to make up for that. Does losing Stephon Diggs, though, force him to be that runner again and repeat what he did last year? Because when they were doing that, where he was running a lot near the red zone, especially late in the year, it was because they kind of had to win games, and it allowed them to win a lot of games. So I wonder if they reproduce that. They've certainly not really added much at receiver. You lose Stephon Diggs, you get Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel's no scrub, but at his best, I don't think was ever close to good as Diggs at his best. I don't know that Samuel's still at his best anymore. I think he's still pretty good. Right now, I would say that the top target of the team is probably the tight end Dalton Kincaid.
Dalton Kincaid.
With a bit of a breakout last year, I think they expect a massive step forward. So Kincaid might be a good beneficiary. They actually started to target James Cook a lot too. So it wouldn't surprise me if a tight end and a running back are his top targets. And I think Allen can still operate like that. Again, the weekly ceiling can almost match Jalen Hurts at times, and the yearly ceiling as well. I think it's 5 years in a row now, 4 or 5 years in a row, where he's finished either as the QB1 or the QB2 overall in fantasy football scoring. So
those are his top 10 fantasy quarterbacks entering this year. There's redraft. There's all kind of other stuff going on. But next week, we're going to concentrate on the running backs. And there's one I'm looking for in that list. He is Kyle Senra, our fantasy expert extraordinaire. He drops some knowledge each and every week, and we're going to peek into the minds of fantasy players, and we're going to play a little fantasy football ourselves. Thank you, my friend, very, very much. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Snowman.
Man, I think I'm going to have a little fun because Josh Graham is next.